So without further ado, I'll introduce Dr. Michael Holstead from St. Norbert's College. He's the director of the Center for Norbertine Studies up there, as well as a professor, and he will be going first to share about the background of the Norbertines. Thank you.
There you go. That works. Yeah, thank you, Paul. I appreciate that. And thank you, everyone, for coming. This is really great. It's amazing to turn out the people. I'm so excited. My name is Michael Holstead, and I'm the director for the Center for Norbertine Studies at St. Norbert College. It's in the library. And so we've had these diaries of Father Max Gärtner. So my supervisors are the Norbertine priests, and I'll talk a little bit about them. But they've just been there, and every time I ask about them, they're like, well, we don't have anyone to translate them, and they're just here, you know. And so so the past few years I've been able to work with Paul and with Dr. Singerton on these projects, and it's really opened my eyes to the amazingness of these diaries, but also just how much information it can share, and how important it is to so many different groups of people. So I've been excited, and I've been spreading the news out on our campus and to the Norbertines. The Norbertines up in Pere actually don't hardly know anything at all about this, so they've been slowly becoming aware of it, and it's been wonderful for me. So what I'm going to do today is talk for about 20 minutes and just give like a high-level overview of, first of all, who the Norbertines are, but then kind of what they were doing here and kind of what happened before I turn it over to my colleagues, and they'll talk about the granular details. So, to understand what the Norbertines were trying to do here in this region, you need to understand a little bit about who they are. And the Norbertines are officially known as the Canons Regular of Prairie. Canons are a group of religious men who serve together in a large church or cathedral or abbey. Regular comes from the Latin word regula, which means rule. And the canons follow a rule, kind of a set of guidelines by which they live as a community. And Prairie is the original location in France, which St. Norbert chose for his followers, right? And so that's their title. In English, we call them the Norbertines, most of us do, and then they're also known as the Premonstratensians, which is a little bit, doesn't roll off the tongue as easy, right? So the Norbertines, we just call them. So St. Norbert was an innovator. He formed a new way of living for religious men and women in the 12th century, right? He blended together two distinct lifestyles, the life of monks and the life of canons. So monks live together in a community, apart from society. They follow a rule, a regula, and they spend days in contemplation and prayer, right? And canons, again, this is 12th century, right? 1100s. Right? Canons tended to the needs of their church and the people. They were priests, right? So they said mass at parishes. They cared for the poor and sick. They offered hospitality to travelers. They worked with the people in the community, whereas monks were separate aside. So St. Norbert in the 12th century merged the two together, taking what he thought was the best elements of the two and combining them. So that's what the Norbertines do. They live in society. The concept is called communio for them, a living together in a community, right? And they commit themselves to a very particular community, right? The smaller ones are called priories, smaller as in the number of men that live in the community. They're called priories. They're led by a prior. The closest one here is just a new one in Springfield, Illinois. The larger communities are called abbeys. They're led by an abbot. This is Abbot Dane Radecki up in Pere. And the Norbertines traditionally, they traditionally build their abbeys in quieter, secluded spaces away from the busy city centers, which is why Father Inama probably chose or liked the idea of having his future monastic community be in Roxbury rather than Prairie du Sac or Sauk City, which he probably thought were going to be the bigger city centers, right? Just outside in the quieter space. That's where the Norbertines like to be. Right, so they were founded in the 12th century, 1121, by St. Norbert of Xanten, right? This is in the time of the Holy Roman Empire. Norbert was actually a member of the nobility. His on both his mother's and father's side, he's biologically related to the emperor, right? So he's in the high nobility class. Right around the age of 35, though, he kind of has a conversion. He was always part of the priesthood. He was given as a young child to the priests. to be raised to become a priest, but he really converts his way of life and in about mid-30s up to age 40, and he decides to found a new order, and that's the Norbertines. And he founds it at Prémontré, France, which is this cross-shaped valley in the middle of a dense forest, like the swamp. And he's like, this is where I want to be, form his order. So the Norbertines spread really rapidly. Within 5 years, or a few years, there's 5 abbeys in France, Belgium, and Germany. And then within a few generations, there were over 100 across Europe, right? And continues to be explosive growth throughout sort of the next couple hundred years. And so that there are over 1,000 communities of men and women across Europe at its height, right around the 1400s, right? Just explosive growth throughout Europe. And they're also actually in Jerusalem during the Crusades. They have a couple abbeys down there, and they're famous battle that takes place there. At one of their abbeys gets sacked and destroyed by the Muslims. So over the centuries, though, the order, that growth is unsustainable. There's all sorts of issues that happens that cause it to fade away. They face, the Black Plague, wars of every kind. Almost every major war in Europe hits them, affects them somehow. Commendatory abbots, internal problems they had. The Protestant Reformation takes away a lot of abbeys, the Enlightenment, communism, everything out through history, so that by the 1830s, they're on the verge of extinction. There's only 5 abbeys left out of the 1,000 communities, there's 5 left. By 1834, even Prémontré is stripped by the French government, who says, no more these monastic communities, right? So that in 1834, the last abbot general of the Norbertines, who's in exile at Notre Dame Cathedral, receives a letter saying that there's hope. Some of the abbeys are going to be allowed to rebuild and reform. And so we have a new chapter of rebirth that starts right around 1840, right? So at this point in time, they're seeking, I want that one? I forget. No, not yet. Oh, sorry about that. They're seeking to reclaim their old abbeys right around 1840, but they're also embracing this missionary zeal that's happening across Europe, and they're sending Norbertines out into places that they actually hadn't before, regions of the world like India and Africa, Australia, and of course America. And it's America that holds some of their greatest hope, right? So this is where we are, 1800s, right around 1800, America, there's Catholics are a small minority, but around 1840, mass immigration, predominantly from Irish and German, dramatically increases the Catholic population in the U.S., and they're pushing westward into the westward states and territories, like the Wisconsin Territory, right? But the Catholic Church at this point in time has a lot of difficulties keeping up with this tremendous growth, because they're still early in its institutional development, and they are struggling with financial shortages. They have a severe lack of clergy, and this is hitting particularly hard for the Germans, with the German-speaking immigrants who often feel neglected by the Catholic clergy, which are predominantly Irish. So to address this need, the Catholic Church in America seeks assistance from Europe. And it comes from a variety of sources in Europe, but for the German-speaking Catholics, aid comes particularly from mission societies, like the Ludwig Mission Society, which is established in Munich in 1838, and the Leopoldine Society, which was established in Vienna in 1829, right? And they're trying to promote Catholicism and Catholic missions in the U.S., and they're also trying to build missionary zeal in Europe. And one of those individuals who's inspired by this is Father Gilbert Inama, right, who is a Premonstratensian canon from Wilton Abbey in Innsbruck, Austria. In 1842, Inama obtains permission from his abbot to dedicate 3 years of his life towards missionary work in America for the German-speaking immigrants, right? So he arrives in New York in March of 1843, and he first makes his way to, New York, of course. There's most people travel to Europe, end up through New York. So he goes to Utica, New York, where he tends to the needs of a number of parishes, and among other things, he helps found a church in Syracuse. But New York is not his intended destination, right? He writes in a letter in 1846 that I landed in New York having in mind to travel through Philadelphia and Baltimore to Cincinnati, right? But then great scarcity of German priests in the city of New York alone, where 8 are ministering now, but at present, in 1842, there are only 2 Catholic priests. That's New York City, 2 Catholic priests, right? Forced me to remain there and help out during the Easter time. And 3 months later, at the urgent request of the most reverend bishop to take over the land mission in Utica, right? So the first sentence is what matters, right? He wanted to go to Cincinnati, right? And why Cincinnati? Well, Cincinnati, because he had made a promise when he was in Rome to the vicar general. The vicar general is like the one that supports the bishop, right, of a certain community. So the vicar general of the Diocese of Cincinnati was a man named John Martin Henny. Father Inama had promised that he would meet with the Bishop of Cincinnati, right? So that was his intention, right? So Father Inama goes there in April of 1843, meets with the bishop, Bishop Purcell, and Bishop Purcell proposes to Father Inama to establish a Norbertine monastery in Ohio, and Father Inama declines. He's not capable of committing to that. But the important thing here is the idea of a Norbertine monastery in the U.S. It was originally supposed to be a mission trip, but the idea here Inama gets is, we can form a monastery, right? And that's what's key. In reality, he actually has another destination, which he writes in 1844. It became possible to carry out one of my most cherished projects, to tour the far west, he calls it, to acquaint myself by personal observation with the state of our holy religion, in particular with the needs of the German Catholic immigrants in that far-off region. Right? On the report that 8 missionaries were coming in with Raffiner, it was my intention to emigrate permanently to the west. Right? And so he sets out for the west in September of 1844, visiting the dioceses of Detroit, Chicago, Milwaukee, Dubuque, and then all the way south in St. Louis. And we hear from his letters that all the bishops there are begging him to stay. Right? There's such a shortage of priests everywhere that they're begging him to stay. But it's the Bishop of Milwaukee that captures his attention. Right? The 2 men had a former connection, right, in Milwaukee, because this guy is John Martin Henny, right, who he had met 2 years earlier. This was the vicar general, right? Henny had just been elected as bishop in late of 1843. He's consecrated in March of 1844. The new Diocese of Milwaukee, which covers the whole state of now Wisconsin and actually parts of Minnesota, right? This new diocese has a significantly large and growing Catholic German immigrant population. And so Bishop Henny needs German-speaking priests, right? So it's Father Inama, right? He's trying to recruit him. So Bishop Henny offers Inama any place in the diocese for the purposes of settling permanently in the region. And he recommends the far west part of the region. And this is where many German-speaking immigrants have settled, scattered, across the area. And so Father Inama visits this region, and he's mesmerized by the beauty, by the fertility of the land, and he decides to settle in this region and this area, right? And so he comes to Roxbury in November. Well, he comes in November of 1845 to Roxbury, and the following spring he builds an 18-foot by 20-foot log cabin, right, and calls it St. Norbert House, right? And this small cabin serves as the region's first Catholic church and marks the beginning of the Norbertine presence in Wisconsin, right? In 1847 then, so we're in 1845, so jump 2 years later, 1847, the Norbertine presence grows when Father Maximilian Gärtner from Wilton Abbey also joins, right? And he brings 2 novices and 4 brothers from the abbey as well. Another Wilton Norbertine named Father Francis Saylor joins in 1952, and 2 more are sent over from Wilton, right? So we have this small presence of Austrian Catholic missionary priests, and their presence in turn reciprocally draws more German Catholic settlers to the regions, primarily from the region of like Prussia and Bavaria and Austria and Westphalia, right? And for decades then, these Norbertines tend to the spiritual needs of Catholics, mostly German-speaking, but also other Irish-speaking ones as well. And in Sauk County, Dane County, is the surrounding counties. And then Father Inama, for all of his tireless efforts, earns the title Apostle of the Four Lakes region. During these years then, the priests here are trying to accomplish essentially three goals. One, as priests, is to tend to the spiritual needs of the German-speaking immigrants, say Mass for the parishioners. They're both highly educated men, having had essentially professorship positions in Europe. So as teachers, they're trying to educate the youth in the Catholic faith by forming a college. They talk about the idea of forming St. Norbert College on the banks of the Wisconsin. It doesn't come to fruition, but that's one of their goals. And then as canons, they want to live as a community. They want to form a monastery here and have the first self-sufficient Norbertine monastery. Now, they're only successful in that first goal. Eventually, when it became apparent that the goal of founding a monastery wasn't going to happen, that Wilton Abbey recalls Father Gärtner, and that's 1958. I'm sorry, not 1958, sorry, 1858. Yeah, that's 107 years later, he's called, sorry. So in 1858, and the college, of course, never comes to fruition as well. Despite the challenges that they face, though, Father Inama dedicates himself to the region until his death in 1879. And the last Norbertine here, Father Hegel, dies in 1890. And that's the official end of the Wilton mission in North America. And so thinking about, from the perspective of the challenges they faced and, well, what from their end went wrong, what are the issues that they faced, I think we can break it down to five elements. One is their geographic scope was just too vast. It demanded almost constant activity from the Norbertine priests. And so the Norbertines were rarely all present in their house at Roxbury at the same time. And this is a problem because communal living is central for the Norbertines. And without it, you can't have a monastery. So you have to, part of that is daily singing of the choral liturgy together. You need at least two to sing the choral liturgy together. So, and that was a big issue. And then the second one, lack of local vocations. The population is scattered. There's a predominantly agrarian economy. There's a lack of Catholic educational opportunities for the young men. And these are all prohibitive factors that prevent the young men from joining, that prevent the Norbertines from finding and developing priests to join their community. Third, you can make the case that Father Inama's approach to his vision of a Norbertine monastery on the banks of the Wisconsin was fundamentally flawed right from the beginning, right? He attempts to apply what is essentially an old world, almost feudal style of land management to new America, and it just doesn't work. We learned from some of the land records of Dane County that Father Inama acquires up to 1,260 acres of land with the idea that the fruits and the resources of which are going to be used to support the community, right? Maintain the community. But there's a problem with this, that land is being sold for so cheap here, and you can be acquired so easily, 80 acres, that these poor sort of immigrants that are trying to escape the old world, when they come here, they are much more likely to scrap up whatever funds they can and through bank loans acquired to buy a parcel of 80 acres for themselves rather than serve as renters or tenants to a landlord, right? And so Father Inama has hundreds of acres of land, but he doesn't have sufficient labor to work them. So his plan kind of backfires. It's almost like feudal style. It backfires. It just doesn't work as well. Another, related to this, the impoverished local community, there's constant recognition by Father Inama and Gärtner that the settlers just don't have money. There's no money at all. And they're like physical money at times. It's just like there's not even coins around, so. And both priests are reticent to beg for funds from these individuals who have nothing anyway. And so there's a report from Father Inama that he does have a married couple to work one of his farms, but he doesn't have $12 in hand to pay them for their labor. So that's a problem. And then Father Gärtner, there's a funny story there, and Father Gärtner finally comes to America to meet, his confrere, Father Inama. Inama takes him and is like, "Where's the money? Do you have the money?" He's so desperate for money, and Gärtner's like, "Yeah," but he's worried, what is this, he's nervous. So it's, so one of the reasons for these letters of Inama, and I imagine the journals of Father Gärtner, is to report to Europe the efforts that they're doing in Wisconsin and to appeal for funds from anyone who might be able to give money, from Wilton Abbey, from the Archbishop of Vienna, from the Leopoldine Society, the Austrian nobility, whomever, right? Whoever can give money. And that's where they receive their funds, predominantly, is from Europe. And that's not sustainable, right? And then the last one is the limited support of Wilton Abbey, right? The one reason that the Norbertine mission in De Pere succeeds in establishing a monastery where it didn't here is because the mother abbey was Bern Abbey in the Netherlands. And they kept sending regular influxes of men to the small community, right? And this helped because they started a college, but the young men weren't quite, they had to educate them and build the community that way. And that takes time. Bern Abbey sent something like 28 men over a couple of decades, whereas Wilton Abbey sent 4. So, and there was a larger local population in De Pere at the time, so it worked out better. And then when the Abbot Rugel Wilton Abbey dies in 1951, the sort of internal support kind of. Did I say 19? Oh my God! Thank you. 1851. Yes. Yes, it's actually, I've written 1951 too. 1851, yes. Support from the Abbey soon diminishes. And so in 1858, they recall Gärtner back, and that essentially signifies the end of the Abbey's support, right? So that's I think, some of the factors preventing the Norbertines from successfully establishing roots in south central Wisconsin. But of course, their efforts did leave a lasting historical, cultural, social impact on the landscape here, the Catholic landscape in Wisconsin. And there's no doubt that the Norbertines' efforts here, the goodwill, the high reputation they developed, paved the way for the Bern Abbey Norbertines in De Pere to help them establish it, right? It's just that was just 3 years later in 1893 that they sent Norbertines to De Pere. So yeah, that's my high-level overview for you all, kind of some of the things. So what I would like to do now is turn it over to Dr. Singerton to talk about some of the granular details and some of his research.
Sure, thank you. Great. Okay, so thank you, Michael, and thank you to everybody who's turned out today for this series of talks. Thank you very much to Jack, who I think is at the back over here, for setting up today. Thank you for the other assistants in recording and sound technicians and the paparazzi we can see at the back there. It's immensely so grateful that you can all come to hear this talk, and I'm very grateful, of course, to Paul, who has set this up, and the fruitful collaboration that myself, Paul, and Michael have had over the last couple of years. It's my second time in the great city of Sauk City. I came, I think it was 2023, and I had a wonderful time with Laurie here and Rhonda and Jack and Paul, where we traipsed through the fields just outside the town here to the original site of the sort of chapel, or what would have been the St. Norbert Monastery. So I have very fond memories of that trip, and of course now of this trip here. As Paul said, my name is Jonathan Singerton. I'm a sort of assistant professor at the university in Amsterdam, at the Vrije Universiteit of Amsterdam. My job here today is essentially to give us a little bit more context on not only Gärtner, Maximilian Gärtner, but also to look at the mission that happened here in Roxbury and Sauk City from this European perspective. So to give a little bit more background of what happened there. I speak with a sort of heavy British accent, so if there's any questions, then please feel free to ask me at the end if there's anything you want clarified or translated for the broad audience here. So first of all, I want to sort of set our scenes, right? So if we're thinking about the early 19th century, I want to have some kind of facts and figures in our heads that we can work with. And bouncing off of what Michael has just said, the Catholic Church in the period after the American Revolutionary War, or as we call it in the UK, the Tax Evasion War, is on a rather poor standing. So the Catholic Church is not as it is today in the United States with many great cathedrals and institutions. It is essentially a young, growing community and church. And as Michael said, it is suffering in a sense from a lack of material, lack of money, and a lack of clergy. The US population overall is around, let's say, 3 million to 8 million inhabitants in this time, so a large upswing. It's also a place that is seeing more and more Catholics arrive, mainly from German and Irish stock. Many of the people in the room, I'm sure, have German ancestry or even Irish ancestry, and these kind of religious lines run strongly then in those kind of communities. So we have around 200,000 or so Roman Catholics in around 1820, so the eve of Gärtner's mission, and most of those again are Irish but also Germans, and especially in places like Wisconsin, it is the German Catholic communities that are underserved by the wider Catholic Church, simply because they don't have German-speaking priests and clergy. So there's a dire need for that at that time. In general, the Catholic Church and its bishops, there were 8 bishops in 1820, are trying essentially to bring together more and more funding into their diocese so that they can reach local parishes and keep the faith amongst these new immigrant groups. One of them, Bishop de Bourg, who was one of the 3 French bishops at that time, has served his diocese quite well. The French were used by the Catholic Church in the United States to keep the faith amongst its population because of the French Revolution. Right? These French clergy had fled from France, they'd come over to the United States, and they'd found essentially work in those dioceses. But fast forward to our period, around the 1820s, and after the Revolution, these French clergy can return home. So there's indeed a greater crisis then for any clergy of any language to work in these dioceses. And de Bourg, who looks over the new sort of Diocese of Louisiana, which at that time covered the vast territory that Jefferson purchased in 1803, the Louisiana Purchase, right, all of the Midwest essentially, down to the Mississippi. He sends his vicar general, essentially his assistant, to Europe to go and raise some funds. And he writes even a pamphlet, you see here, the Notice de l'état de mission de Louisiane, saying how dire the situation is. And for those of you who can read the screen here at the front, it's a little bit exaggerated, right? He says that, would you believe that we are forced to borrow even a table to write? So he couldn't even write his pamphlet without borrowing, without loaning a table, right? That's how dire things are as such. So he writes this in 1822, he sends his vicar general to France, where he knows that there are new sort of missionary societies starting. There's one in Lyon in particular, old friends of his, who have gathered together funds from local communities, donated them to a sort of central pot, and are now giving those to clergy across France, and especially in the French Empire, so in places like China later on, where they want to have a more Christian mission. And so he essentially sends his vicar general there to ask, well, can we have some of this money as well for my territory of Louisiana? He's met with success, right? So the Lyon Society, this French society, donate money to the bishop in Louisiana to receive funds for his diocese. This sparks a little bit of an interest, right, amongst the other American bishops who think, well, that's a grand idea. Maybe I will do this for my diocese. So Bishop Fenwick, the Bishop of Cincinnati, before at the time of Inama's arrival, sends his vicar general, this man you see here on the right, Friedrich Jeser, who later on becomes the Bishop of Detroit. Right? They all sort of, let's say, get nice positions in the church later on. He sends him over to Europe to do the same thing, ask for money, see if we can raise some support from Europe to support our diocese. We need to build churches, we need to have even things like chalices and whatever, tabernacle, to make these missions viable. So Jeser goes to France, asks them for money. They say, no, we've given money already to Louisiana and Kentucky. We are giving money to the rest of the church worldwide. you will have only the small amount that we can spare. He goes to Rome, and in Rome he's hoping that the Pope and Propaganda Fide, the Church's institution for supporting missions worldwide, will help. And the Pope and the Propaganda Fide, this organization, say, well, we look after the entire global church. We cannot make any sort of special arrangements as such. You will get a small amount of a small allowance from the church, but we won't give any particular, let's say, special funds for this. But whilst in Rome, he hears from the ambassador from Vienna that if you headed over to Vienna, to the Austrian Empire, maybe there you'll meet with some success. So indeed he follows this lead. He goes to Vienna where he finds there is a willingness to support the mission. And at this point it's interesting to point out why that might be the case. Why don't the Austrians simply donate money to the Romans, right, to Propaganda Fide? Or why don't they simply use the existing French system, right? Well, think about it, right? This is the 1820s, after Napoleonic Wars, not really a lot of love in Austria for France, right? Napoleon had traipsed through Vienna not too long before then, had squatted in the great palace of Schönbrunn, right? Kicked the emperor out, run into Bohemia, for example. So there's not really any pro-French feeling amongst the clergy, especially in Austria at that time. And the same, let's say, about the Pope. There's not so much, let's say, willing to cooperate. So they want instead their own national organization. So the people who Reza meets, the emperor's brother, who is a Cardinal Archduke Rudolf, as well as the Archbishop, the Prince Archbishop of Vienna, get together and they say, we will found a new mission society that will support just the American missions. So not the world or China or India or any other place, just the North American missions. So those in the US and Canada, but predominantly those here in the US. And their aim is particularly unique because they will also support just the Catholic Germans in the US. So their idea is to specifically support the Catholic Germans. This leads to what Michael mentioned briefly, the Leopoldine Society. This is the sort of study that I'm looking at, the book that I'm writing about this organization, because it had, as you will see in the next slides, an immense impact in this country. It's founded in 1829, in January of 1829, when the Pope gives his blessing. And in May, they hold the first sort of inaugural celebratory mass and meetings for the society. It's a little bit of a sort of hybrid state and church organization, because not only do you have leading industrialists backing the society, giving money to the society, sitting on its board of advisors as such, but you also have then the clergy running the society in-house as such. You have clergy gathering donations, processing reports, and this kind of thing. It's named the Leopoldine Society, or die Leopoldinenstiftung in German, after Saint Leopold, who is the patron saint of Vienna. But there's also a double meaning to that, because it also reflects the Archduchess Leopoldine, who married into the Brazilian royal house and became the first empress of Brazil after the revolutions there. And she died just a few years before this organization was founded. So they do this in sort of honor of her, as a living link between the Habsburgs in the old world and the Habsburgs in the new world as such, right? Because remember, it's the same dynasty as such that first colonized the Americas under the Spanish Habsburgs of Charles V and so on much earlier. So there's this link that they want to also keep alive in that way. They gather from all parts of the monarchy. And remember, the Habsburg monarchy stretches from much of Eastern Europe, from parts of Poland and Hungary to parts of Italy at that time. They gather from almost everywhere money to be donated to the society. And they have a tremendous effect over the lifespan of this society. So as I said, it runs from 1829. It continues up until the First World War, up until 1914, when obviously the Austrians had a little bit else on their mind to worry about. In this time, they gathered together around 4.2 million Austrian kroner or crowns, which might not sound a lot, but that translates to roughly 30 million American dollars. And remember, this is American dollars of the 19th century, right? That buys you an awful lot more at Walmart back then than it does now, yes. Okay? They also, on top of that, raise about 300,000 crowns, which is another significant amount of money, purely to send over priests who are willing to act as missionaries, priests who are willing to transfer or relocate to other sees and other parishes to continue the Catholic faith. So they send an enormous amount of money to people just to come over and missionize. Of this society, around 500 churches can trace its origins, right? Either in money donated to build the church or the person that sort of established the church in the community. So there are at least 500 churches in the US that essentially owe part of their existence to this organization. Again, it has some sort of level of imperial patronage, right? So it raises the status of all these connected beneficiaries and individuals. And of those missionaries that I mentioned that received money to come over here, there are about 420, right? So 420 priests who come over the course of the 19th century from Central Europe to the United States with money from this organization. So it's a massive injection, essentially, of not just money, but also personnel into these parishes, as Michael said, was sorely needed. It meets with some great success. So around 23 bishops can be counted as beneficiaries of this organization. So it helped 23 individual bishops. 4 archbishops come from parts of Austria today because of that, right? So people from this area especially. And of course, the first male American saint, John Neumann, was one of these beneficiaries who came to the United States with this money as well. So there's that sort of direct link as such. And here you can see just a few individuals. Remember I said there's about 420 of them connected to this, but here on the far left, if anybody recognizes this, you get a golden apple. But this is Friedrich Katzer, right, the Archbishop of Milwaukee at one point. You have John Neumann, the saint that I just mentioned. The very happy chappy here on the middle left is Franz Pires, and you would look that happy if you traipsed around Minnesota for the best part of 20 years in your 70s, and then retired in your 80s back to Ljubljana in Slovenia and died in your 90s. He was an immensely sort of impressive person with great fortitude to do this. And here on the far right, anybody recognize? No, we're in the wrong part of Wisconsin, but this is Friedrich Berager, right? The sort of apostle of the north, right? Of the upper peninsula and upper parts of Wisconsin and sort of northeastern parts of Minnesota. So these men who are, let's say, very much recognizable to Catholics, well, outside of this area, to Catholics in the United States, right? They are men that would not have been here otherwise without the support of the society. And all of these men are sort of, let's say now, either venerated or beatified or on road to canonization as well. So they are, let's say, looked upon quite favorably. It's the only chart I'm going to show, so don't panic for those of you who don't like numbers, okay? But this, I want to just give you a bit of an impression that this is the amount of money that was sent per year from Austria to the diocese, to the churches, to the missionaries, to the causes here of the Catholic Church. What this shows you, for those of you who don't like this sort of thing, is that most of the money, around 50%, came before the Civil War. So in the period we're talking about with Gärtner and Gärtner, the 1840s and 50s, that's the high point, essentially. That's when this money is sort of flooding in to these places from Austria. And of course, Gärtner and Gärtner are constantly wondering where their share of the money is going to come from. After the Civil War, there's a bit of a trickle, let's say, up until 1914, but it is a continual trickle. So there is still support throughout these 7 or 8 decades or so. Obvious blips, right? So there's one big decline there in that year. That's 1848. If any history buffs remember what happened in 1848, it's not a good time to be in Europe. It's when the revolutions break out. So obviously they forget to send the money over that year. Up here, just before the sort of Civil War, again, another sort of rush to send over the funds before war breaks out and disrupts things as well. So there's obvious patterns in the data as well that we can assume. We can get a lot of that data from the archives in Vienna, but one of the most successful things has been for the historians in the United States are these reports, right? The Berichte der Leopoldinenstiftung. These things are essentially compiled reports from the missionaries themselves. They detail all sorts of things about American life and society and culture from the perspective of these various bishops and missionaries. And they're all published from this time in around 1831 to 1914, in around 85 volumes. So they're very, very voluminous and a very interesting resource. Of course, written in German, but some of them have been translated, some of them have been worked on by academics in the US. So again, they're a fascinating resource that touch upon all corners of American life. That's the good news. Bad news is, of course, there are some in the US at this time who don't look favourably upon what is happening by the Austrian authorities, by the Leopoldine Society, and so on. One of them, Justin D. Fulton, who, if you can guess from the quote here, is a Protestant, sees this as nothing other than a sort of political insurgency in the United States. And I think it's worth reading this quote out. I've highlighted, I think, a few of the important points on it. But he says, the Emperor of Austria, Prince Metternich, and Leo XII, the Pope at the time, established the Leopold Society. I mean, if he's going to complain about it, he should get the name right. But the Leopold Society, for the avowed purpose of aiding the Church of Rome in the subjugation of the American people to the Roman Catholic worship. The Leopold Society is a political institution under the control of the Austrian cabinet and the Pope of Rome. It was called into existence at the earnest solicitation of American bishops, who supplicated aid to enable them to stay the onward march of truth. It aims at nothing less than the overthrow of the civil and religious liberty. The plans of this society have been formed with the political sagacity of that which characterized the Church in her palmiest days. So quite heavy stuff and quite heavy critique. But I think not only does it show you sort of the tensions in American society, right? Think of the riots in Cincinnati that take place in the early 19th century against Catholics, but it also shows you that for people like Fulton and Protestants at this time, this society is the number one, right? This is the thing that really alerts them to the, let's say, influence that Central Europe and the Europeans are having upon American Catholicism. Of course, he sees this as a target for criticism, but I think it shows and reflects the importance of this organization and institution. This caricature is typical from that time, right? So the spectre, let's say, of Roman Catholicism looking over the US, especially as the US manifests its destiny towards the West Coast. And the image you see on the left there is another pamphlet written in an equally fiery tone against the Leopoldine Society, written by a man called Brutus. That was his nickname in the papers of New York when he published the sort of predecessor to these essays. We know him today as Samuel B. Morse, the inventor of Morse code. Absolutely hated what Gärtner and people who supported Gärtner were doing. So let's move to Maximilian Gärtner now in the sort of, let's say, last half of my small talk. So as Michael pointed out, Gärtner came from Wilton Abbey after Namur to this area. So you see the wonderful Wilton Abbey, this wonderful Baroque church and structure just on the outskirts of Innsbruck today. Wilton Abbey, it should be pointed out, is a very historic landmark in the city, right? This is wonderful, gigantic Baroque structure. It's established by the Benedictines in the 800s. It's re-established as a Norbertine Abbey not long after St. Norbert himself. So it is a sort of a long-standing feature in the city's history. The Norbertines have a particularly, as Michael was saying, a particular sort of emphasis on placing themselves in the community, but just outside the community. In this case, the Tyrolean Norbertines in Innsbruck had a great effect on the city's education, right? As instructors in its gymnasium, in its high schools, and in its local educational establishments. It's for that reason that a few centuries later, in the 18th century, during the high point of Enlightenment, they survived the great purge of monasteries led by the emperor, who wants to get rid of all of what he sees as the useless contemplative ones that pray instead of do. And so this survives because of that role they play in the local community by educating its youth and its elites and so on. And so it's that reason it is one of those 5 abbeys that Michael pointed out that survive in Europe during the Enlightenment because of that role. It doesn't last too long, that good run, right? In 1806, when the French backed Bavarian troops march in, they dissolved the abbey, right? Again, the French Revolution, very anti-religious in a sense, sort of, sort of cancel culture of its time in a sense. It's re-established in 1816 under the terms of the Congress of Vienna, and from then on it is still a prominent then Norbertine feature during that time. So that's the sort of background that, let's say, Gärtner had coming through that abbey. But his own personal background is, I think, also a little more interesting for us. So he comes from Heitervang, the wonderful town name there, Heitervang, in sort of the local area of Innsbruck, right? So it's in Tyrol, it's not terribly far away at that time. He's born at the end of 1801. He comes from a rather large family, and we see this also from his diary, right? He's a very large Catholic family. It's typical, so several siblings, younger brothers, some older sisters, but a very tight-knit family nonetheless, right? He communicates with them from Sauk City, from Roxbury, throughout this time back home as well. The family of Gärtner, right, Maximilian Gärtner, is essentially a merchant family. They have ties in Vienna as well as in Augsburg, which is in sort of Bavaria or part of southern Germany, and there they are essentially playing a mercantile role. So they have this sort of, let's say, axis between Tyrol, Vienna and Augsburg as their familial background. So they come from a relatively well-off family. And for this reason, Gärtner goes to study Latin and Italian in one of the sort of best provincial schools in Innsbruck, and he later then studies philosophy and theology when it becomes clear he wants to become ordained in the major ecclesiastical centres, right, in Innsbruck, in Brixton and Trient. He enters the abbey in 1826, so again not long after it's refounded in 1816, and he, as a very sort of precocious young man, becomes a minister in 1830. So he's a sort of very fast, let's say, ordination process. And I think his intelligence shows in these diaries and in his abilities, which I'll mention at the end of the talk. He serves as a prefect, right, essentially as a sort of lecturer or instructor at the Theresian Ritter Academy. The Ritter Academy is essentially an elite high school, right, for the young nobility, established by Maria Theresia, the Austrian empress from the 18th century. And this gives, I think, Gärtner also a high standing in the community, right? He's chosen because of his abilities, but this means that he is teaching the young nobility of the future. So he's a very sort of well-connected, well-respected individual. And on top of that, he has the normal pastoral requirements in the sort of suburbs of Innsbruck, right? In Wels and Hütting and so on like this. 1841 is a pivotal year because in 1841, and so 11 years or so after he became a priest, he travels to Italy, and he is chosen to travel on this mission to Italy to accompany two Norbertine brothers because of his skills in Italian and Latin. So the local abbot feels that he will be a good translator for these German priests, and so Gärtner is chosen essentially to serve as their secretary and their translator. When he's there, he not only describes the sort of wonderful scenes of Rome, but he comes to know the people working in Propaganda Fide, that global institution essentially of managing the missions for the church worldwide. He meets the Pope at the same time, but he's more impressed by those in the Propaganda Fide, and he feels his mission, his calling in life is to work abroad, is to work outside of his local community. Even though he's well respected, he has this sort of feeling that he wants to go on a mission outside of, let's say, Europe at that time. Before I move on, that's the school. It still exists today, the Ritter Academy where Gärtner taught, so it's just next to sort of the local centre. And if you want a sort of another impression of how important and how central he was in this kind of community, right here on the side would be the sort of Hofburg of Innsbruck, the court essentially where the emperor and the empress would stay on their trips to Innsbruck. So he's very much well connected at that time. Turning to, let's say, his mission and what results from it. We'll hear from Paul in the next talk how Gärtner sort of functioned day to day here, how life was for him on the mission. What I want to talk about now in the last few slides here is essentially the diaries, right? These wonderful, wonderful diaries that he has left us that not only describe the minutiae of everyday life, but also give us a fantastical, almost unique insight into these missionaries' lives. Because out of all the ones I've studied, all of the sort of 420 I followed, Gärtner's diaries are by far the most sort of unique in terms of their detail, their content, which you'll see in the next talk as well. And he passes judgment on everybody, right? The gossip is unbelievably good, okay? It's also taken a while to figure out, right? Because over the years I've worked with Paul and Michael on this, we've come to see now that there are several sort of notebooks that Gärtner had that he kept as sort of sketches of daily life and sort of wrote his own autobiography later on, as well as then the actual mission journals, right? So in total there are 7 journals of this mission, right, from 1846 to 1858, One of them takes place mostly in Austria because he went home for the election of an abbot and to sort of visit his family for the first time in several years. But most of these diaries detail then almost every day the life in Roxbury and this area around here. There's a letter that he wrote to one of his great friends who was up in Milwaukee in St. Francis de Sales, Josefina. And he writes in that letter about the sort of process with the diaries. So he first of all wrote little notebooks, those 3 sort of notebooks, and he later wrote out these notebooks into these fuller volume diaries, right? The one which you can read here, and the other one which I'll come on to in a moment. He wrote, "I kept a diary from the beginning, which of course touched on every little thing in my miniature, so to speak, and discussed important incidents in detail. Therefore, in the following period, especially after returning home from America on the idyllic, beautiful Bergisel, that is a sort of little hill that overlooks Wilton, which you know well, I had enough material to work out these notes more extensively, so that in the end I filled 7 volumes." Right? So he himself was surprised that he'd actually created so much, in a sense, right? That he'd written so much about his life here in America. He also wrote in the same letter the following: using my often maligned style of miniature writing. And as an historian, I was quite sort of touched to read that because it showed me that Gärtner is self-aware. He is self-aware of how terrible his handwriting is. and clearly, at the time, people knew how terrible his handwriting was as well, because it was often maligned, of course, right? And to give you an example of that, I took a typical page from one of the volumes of the 7 volumes, which in total is around 1.1 million words, right? 3,000 individual pages. And this is what we have to deal with. This is his miniature handwriting as such, right? Remember, paper cost money as it does now, but a lot more back then. And so he wanted to, economize. And as you will hear from Paul, they were always worried about money, so it makes sense that he wrote in such a small script. But for people like me and my assistant Katerina, who worked on this with me, it makes you blind after a while. So this is a typical sort of entry from the diary. Again, detail after detail after detail. Now and then your eyes have a break when you come upon these wonderful sketches such as this that he produced and created, right, during the diaries. So it's really wonderful to see that, especially after you've had page after page of this. But what it makes up for in sort of difficulty, it provides then in detail and sort of impact, right? It is a wonderful thing to be able to read and have, and this treasure is still available to us. And I should say that the scan that I've been using and working from, and Katerina as well has also been using, comes from Michael and from the centre, because years ago they realized the value of these diaries and they had them digitized and freely made accessible to researchers. So without that, I would have not been able to come across them, and I would not have been able to do my work on these diaries. So essentially what we've been doing over the last 2 years is working on just one of these volumes, right, because they're around, say, 300 pages. In total, again, over 1 million words of these 7 volumes. So we've been turning it from this into this. And this is much more readable, I can promise you, because this is essentially volume 2, which runs to around 260 pages. It's around 130,000 words. We've not only transcribed these from the German into modern German as such, but we've also then translated it, because we know, of course, that German was a local language in the last century, but in this century it has all fallen out of fashion and out of speak. So we have now a sort of translation of the 2nd volume. And again, working with Michael and Paul, we've made this freely available to all of you. So we have a website where you can click this, where you can essentially access this, read through this for your own leisure and for your own community. Because as part of my work as an historian, I want to be able to give back to all of you something from your past as well. And with that being said, this has been a great sort of part for me, personally speaking, because we share this with the sort of the local savants, right? The people who know the area the best, people who are extremely dedicated, such as John, such as Rhonda, such as Laurie, who have gone through the diary and been annotating it essentially with their own local knowledge, with their genealogical skills, with what they know about the area or the families they know. And they have filled our volume so far with hundreds of comments pointing out this is so-and-so's great-grandfather, this plot of land is that, this was this. Things that I, as an academic formerly in Austria, now in the Netherlands, could not do, right? I could not access this local knowledge. So without that, I think it would be impossible to unlock the treasures of this diary. And I just want to take a sort of moment. I think we should all clap for John, for Wanda, for Laurie, for Jack as well, for everybody who's been commenting on this project so far. So thank you all very much.
And to share what your assistant's last name is, it's half of them.
Yes, I should say that the person who worked with me on the transcription, Katerina, her surname, well, she was an Austrian student of mine, her surname is Ziegler, which I'm told half the clan of Ziegler is turned out today. But on that note, Laurie, I wanted to point out that out of all these comments, I think of, let's say if there are something like 600 so far, about 500 of them come from you. Yes. And I've been told extensively by Laurie herself and her husband and her family members who've come today that she's obsessed with this diary in a good way, right? Yes. As her sort of main hobby and occupation. And again, as appreciation of how much I truly couldn't do this without you, I brought a small gift for you from the Netherlands. So I'd like you to take this and open it. Thank you. Of course, welcome.
Should I open it?
Yes, by all means, show everybody what it is.
Is it more work?
There's 6 more to go. You're welcome. So, if I could bestow honorary doctorates, I would give my first one to Laurie.
Thank you.
You're more than welcome. So again, without the local community here, we couldn't unlock these treasures essentially, right? So this is the sort of project that we wish to pursue. And again, there are 6 more diaries to go, right? So buckle up. Okay, so my final point, I also just want to mention and share with you also what's on the Austrian side as such, because for a long, long time these diaries were kept at the Abbey up in Green Bay in Pere, but there is also a legacy of Gärtner in Austria still, right? So in Wilton, in the Abbey, these essentially are his boxes. In the middle you can see his notebook that was given to him, it seems, as a souvenir to not forget Wilton after he left or when he came back. And it seems he used this little notebook to produce then the diaries as such. So it's very special that that's still there. On the far left you see then number 4, this volume that we've reordered as number 4. This was essentially missing from the collection in De Pere. It's there back in Wilton Abbey as well. So it's also piecing together both communities, right? The one here in Roxbury, but also the one here in Innsbruck in Austria. I used to take when I was a lecturer in Innsbruck, I used to take my students quite often to the Abbey, to the archives, to work with some of these materials. The person you see here on the left is Pater Clemens Halder. He was a Norbertine priest at the Abbey, a monk. He wrote a dissertation about all of these individuals that came from Wilton to Wisconsin. So he was also one of these kind of great influences, and he sadly passed away just a short while ago. So it's a great loss without him. Final thing I want to mention is that Gärtner not only wrote these diaries, he was a prolific writer in many ways. So we have his travel books, right? We have his Italian diaries as well. And then the last thing on the left, we also have his poetry. This is something that was a bit of a surprise to me, was his poetry that he wrote throughout his lifetime as well. There's the I'll leave Michael to pronounce the Latin or such, but there's a manuscript of about 50 pages that he wrote during his youth, right? Mainly sort of novice type poetry, sometimes a little embarrassing. I'm surprised it's still in the archive. But what's interesting for us is this Feierstunden der Musikarbeit, this 452-page volume that spans his entire life. And it is poetry that he wrote and dedicated to his family and to his friends. And it reflected, of course, his own personal trials and tribulations as well. And I could think of, when I was designing this talk, I could think of no better way than to pick one of these poems that he wrote, to translate this and to share with you today, because I think it is quite moving, quite touching, and it is quite aptly named, because it is called To My Friends in Roxbury. And I'll read it out, and that will be my final word. Far across the ocean's wave, to forest broad and free, I came with heart and hope in him to plant the faith's old tree. The fields were bare, the hands were few, yet the spirit still stirred. In each small chapel's candlelight, God's silent voice was heard. And though the dream of abbey walls faded like the frost, the souls I served with word and song redeemed the journey's cost. So friends, if ever memories call from prairie winds or bell, remember me who walked with you and strove to serve you well. Thank you. Well done, Lou.
Thank you, Michael and Jonathan. Truly a great look at how all of this came to be here, and this truly amazing legacy of these journals, and diaries, which will be hopefully unlocked for the first time ever in our lifetime. So I want to just talk about what's in Diary 2, and as well as his other earlier work. This has been translated in the 1960s, but hasn't got as much press as it deserves. And of course, he came here to the Sauk Prairie area after Father Adelbert Anama had gotten here. And of course, we think of it as this uninhabited frontier. It certainly was less inhabited, but of course, mankind has been living here for thousands of years. At Natural Bridge State Park is the oldest known evidence of human habitation in the upper Midwest. And of course, he would have run into effigy mounds and other traces of humanity here from thousands of years ago. He talks about them in some of his works, not as much as Mr. Canfield did, but he would have run across these, especially here in the Sauk City area. And he would have learned that the Sauk, where did the name come from? He's constantly going to Sac and to Sauk, and from the Sauk people that were here in the 1740s with their large village about where Sauk City is today. Long gone by the time he got here, of course, had lent their name to the prairie and to eventually the county and the city. About 20 years before he arrived, all the tribes in the area under the impetus of the federal government had been gathered at Prairie du Sac and made to sign a treaty there of tribal boundaries. This was a new concept for them, but the United States, which liked boundaries, wanted to prevent intertribal warfare as much as possible, as well as know who they're dealing with when time came to obtain that land. Well, you said this is your land, so you're the ones that are going to sign this particular treaty. So he would have known the Ho-Chunk that we know today of as the Winnebago. Eventually, the Winnebago were coerced into signing 3 land cession treaties in this area, on both sides of the Wisconsin River. And during the mid-1830s, early 1830s, the Wisconsin and Fox Riverways were the dividing line of white European and American settlement to the east and south of those waterways, and Indian Territory to the west. But once the Ho-Chunk were coerced into signing the Treaty of 1837, all these properties where we're sitting today, all this land on this side of the river was opened up for Euro-American settlement, and they wasted no time in coming across. So in 1840, Sauk County was laid out geographically. That same year, the forced removal of the Ho-Chunk began, and for the next 34 years, there was periodic attempts to remove them by the federal government and even paid contractors. Of course, they were not successful. They missed plenty of Ho-Chunk that just hid out or simply walked back from being deported across west of the Mississippi River. And these are some of the people that Father Gärtner got to know after time. So by the time he got there, of course, the 2 villages here had been established, Prairie du Sac and Haratsi, or Haratsi Town, after the count that many of you know about. Fortunately, they changed the name to Sauk City because nobody could spell that. Nobody still can. And of course, just on the other side of the river is where St. Norbert House was. You go along Highway 12, not too far. After you go up the hill on the left side, you cross a creek there, and back in the woods there was where St. Norbert House was. Might have wanted to be on this side because he's constantly coming over here to, service the Catholic community in Haratsi. But this is where the 100 acres was given to him by the Count, Augustin Haratsi, on that side of the river. And of course, he did service a lot of Catholic communities on that side of the river too, but he was constantly having to cross the Wisconsin River. So in diary number 1, which has not been translated but has been a lot of material covered in this other volume, here's the famous painting of Prairie and Hrátzy, or Sauk City. And it's quite small. These diaries are like this big, so it's literally this big. And if you turn it on its side, it's a little easier to see. So Prairie du Sac, where we are, is at the top, and Sauk City, or Hrátzy, is at the bottom. And he said in the diary, if you cut this apart and put these together, join them together, you would have a complete view of this area. So he's sitting somewhere over at Willersheim Winery having a glass of wine and painting the scene here. So we do have it, and it's amazing. It's literally that big, but it blows up beautifully. So it's up here, and in the diary he has labeled letters and numbers, different things on there, so you can come up and see what's going on. We'll take a look at them individually. Now, Prairie du Sac up here, of course, was the Yankee settlement. This was not the Catholic settlement, so whether intentionally or not, he kind of conveniently overlooks the fact that this is the county seat. He has no indication that the courthouse is here. It would be moved to Baraboo eventually, but when he painted this, the courthouse was still here, and somehow he conveniently missed that. On the extreme left is number 5, which is the Italian garden that the Count was laying out, and that would be somewhere between here and Sauk City proper, which is now, of course, all connected and hardly discernible. Sauk City probably Hrátzy was a little more, a lot more going on, as you can see by the number of buildings, so he enumerates all of those. He points out Leinenkugel's brewery here on the extreme left. The first Leinenkugel's brewery was here in Sauk City. Another thing of note is the Catholic Church, which is on fire back here. Shortly after he arrived, the hard-fought, built little wooden Catholic church went up in flames, and it was a huge loss. It'd be several years before they would attempt again to build their own church building. So again, you can come up and see that afterwards and see what else is indicated there. So speaking of Hrátzy, of course, he ran into the Count, this larger-than-life figure here that was here for a long time. He was a Hungarian nobleman. He was not a count. He kind of made that part up to be a little more self-aggrandizing, which worked. He had some money, but he also was a charming man and got people to invest in the operation here, including Robert Bryant from Milwaukee. And shortly after his arrival around 1840, they laid out the plat of Hrátzy, which is now Sauk City. And again, it's Hrátzy that kind of tempts Anama with the donation of land here for the operation on the other side of the river. Now, as impressive as he sounds, he was also subject to the same trials and tribulations as everyone here. Including, this is not a picture of his actual place, but works the part. On January 6, 1849, Gärtner wrote, "Bitterly cold again at 9 o'clock, sudden fire at the old Count's. Soon the flames broke out of the windows and roof, and saving the furniture became impossible. I removed various apothecary jars from there because they contained spirits, one barrel of which was still in the cellar, posing an imminent danger. Water from the nearby river contained the fire to some extent, but the annex collapsed, and by 12 o'clock, even the log house, the entire Count's estate. The fire originated from the stovepipe, which passed through the roof without being properly secured." So everybody learned their lessons with fire at one point or another. The cold was also a challenge for everybody. In the winter of 1849-50, routinely, he notes, it's 15 to 25 degrees below zero for days. He mentions that the chalice is routinely frozen solid. He wrote once, "The holy substance in the chalice was so frozen solid that I had to consecrate hot purificators for Adelbert to thaw it." On another day, he records that several sheep and piglets froze in the camp. Sometimes, however, the cold was welcome, like when it froze the Wisconsin River solid enough to cross. This was often a gamble, however, as there was so many times when the ice was not completely safe, In late December of 1850, he wrote, "In the evening I wanted to go over the ice to St. Norbert's house, but got lost 5 times, even came close to the open spot, risking falling through, and only a kind de profundus guided me back on track." So fortunately, he made all of those crossings successfully, or we wouldn't be here today talking about his diaries. Other times when it was not frozen over the Wisconsin River, 8 o'clock, battling the high waves of the river in the boat to Sac. On the way back, the river even more furious, almost perilous. At 9 o'clock, I went to the river. Everything was underwater, including my boat. Therefore, futile attempts to make it float returned home. Large ice drift on the river, still ventured to navigate, but only after an hour of hard work. In the afternoon, went to the river, but the ferry took almost 2 hours to cross, very rough. These are almost unbelievable today when the river is controlled by the great power dam just up the way. But just the physical amount of work it took to get places is staggering. And cold was not relegated to just the winter time. July of 1849, he wrote, "The beans, pumpkins, melons, etc. in the garden froze, even the potatoes and the corn." And of course, this was subsistence farming in large part, so this was life or death kind of situations. May 1850, on the last Sunday, a large prairie fire threatened St. Norbert's house, which Fabing managed to save by plowing furrows. The forest near the cemetery completely destroyed. Now, in volume or diary 2, he left us a great map of southern Wisconsin and his territory. You can just barely make out, well, the underlined words are Sauk Prairie and Norbert House, I believe, and then there's some faint red lines that show his circuit going to places like Columbus, Watertown, Jefferson, Madison, and then on this side of the river, Baraboo, up into Delona Township, far western Sauk County, Baraboo. So about 80 miles by 35 miles wide. So this is where Jonathan was talking about. They're out traveling so much, there is no community because they're constantly tag teaming at St. Norbert House and barely crossing paths at many times. In March of 1849, he wrote, "Departure with Schmidt's cart to Waterloo from 6 to 11 o'clock, and there engaged on an American coal wagon for further travel to Lake Mills." He was always bumming a ride. However, dreadful mud necessitated its use amidst the load of plowshares. Soon the Yankee handed over the entire load to me and trotted ahead without looking back to see if we followed. The horses struggled through until they got stuck in deep mud. What to do? The whip was of no use, so I climbed over the shaft onto the saddle horse and forced my way through. Covered with mud, we reached Lake Mills, and the Yankee, already there, praised my bravery, which he hadn't expected from a Dutch preacher. Of course, he didn't ask for any fare, which I surely had earned twice over. On another time, at 2 o'clock, Judd Klauber arranged a ride to Jefferson, but before reaching the bridge there, a mighty flood and drift ice appeared. It almost happened before the bridge was reached, and at that same time, it cracked from the impact of an ice floe as if everything was about to collapse into rubble. With the good fortune, we made it across in time. So again, a miracle that we're here today talking about him. Another time, this is an AI-generated picture, by the way, so now us historians have some more tools in our kit to find these pictures that don't exist. October of 1849, the stagecoach only arrived at noon and left at 1 p.m. loaded with 8 passengers around 2 p.m. While passing through a large puddle of mud, the coach overturned and threw us all into the mire amid moans and groans. I crawled out on top and helped the second person. However, the lady at the bottom screamed loudly, "Oh, my leg, I broke my leg." People rushed and trampled over her even more. In the end, she emerged completely unscathed, and only her husband suffered a minor bruise on the foot. It was a struggle to lift the heavy cart out of the mud using fence rails. However, it succeeded, fortunately, and there was no breakage except for the carriage nail, which was now replaced by a hammer until the Kellogg's post. Of course, we did not manage to catch up on foot, but nonetheless had to sit down. However, from the post, I and 2 others preferred to make the journey to Watertown, 14 miles, on foot because the road through the entire forest was incredibly bad and showed many pits of mud. And another time, as his territory grew and more settlers came, some Irish moved to northern Sauk County, Irish Catholics, of course, and were wanting his help up there. There's literally nobody else around. So June of 1850, after lunch, off through lonely forests with charming valleys to the Irish settlement in Delona, where we clock of the oldest settler, Patrick Hickey, Assumption, preparation for his imminent end, and comfort for tomorrow through Holy Mass and overnight stay in quiet. June 11th, altar construction, simple, with a table and bed sheets, confession of the sick and 4 others. Around 10 o'clock, about 40 neighbors gathered, and I gave an English address for the worthy celebration of this first religious service there, where no priest had been seen before. In another instance, he wrote, during the morning sermon, 3 Protestant families also attended, declaring loudly they wanted to join us every time. Late, 2 men from the Methodist Church came. Couldn't bear the nonsense anymore. But you'll often find where he's talking about there were no other people, no other pastors around, often case, so Protestants would join the Catholic services occasionally. And he was not afraid, as I think Jonathan said, to speak his mind or call a spade a spade. And some of this we'll never know more about, but July of 1849, I informed the builder, Maurer Wright in Sac, of the decision of the Right Reverend Bishop, quote, if the concubine does not leave, public excommunication will follow, unquote. He understood this, but dismissing the woman was impossible for him. So he had to deal with that. June 1850, the marriage of the old Stefan Ubring from Sac with the old M.A. Schmidt from the Gleis family, certainly good for him, as he was otherwise more likely to be in danger of burning down his own hut, as the flames had already flared up a couple of times. Not sure what he's talking about there, but it's not the fire in the stove. He also, of course, as I mentioned, ran into indigenous people around here, particularly the Ho-Chunk. And in April of 1849, he wrote, we had a lively conversation with the Indian guests, which included singing songs to my flute and also hearing them partly in French, partly in Indian in the Catechism of Baraga, in the Ottawa language. In Mrs. LaCoyer, we found an interpreter, and she made me somewhat familiar with the very difficult pronunciation of the same tongue, especially in the case of the Our Father. So he was always looking to increase his language skills. And he wrote a wonderful, almost 2-page account of Indian courtship and marriage customs, which you can ask us about afterwards. And he was also really something of the only physician, doctor, any medical, in the area, and was often called upon to render his services. And he was very much into homeopathic medicine. He had a great disdain for normal medicine. One time he wrote, called to Mrs. Kletch, who suffered from severe throat inflammation already for 3 days, despite all gargles and raps from the doctors. I gave her 2 doses of mercury, and by noon she showed improvement. That'll either cure you or kill you. One time he wrote, after preparation of several homeopathic medicines which caused dizziness, apparently as a result of their effect, meaning he got dizzy himself preparing his own homeopathic medicines. And lastly, but suddenly there was news that shoemaker Fleischmann had broken his foot while raising the house for the Bamberg gardener Marklein. I hurried to the scene, applied emergency bandaging, and arranged for his transport home, then obtained tincture and made compresses that had the best effect. Thus a surgical feat without a diploma. After 2 days, the man removed the tight splints and immediately relocated the fracture, resulting in severe inflammation soon after. They called me, received, deservedly, a reprimand, but also a fresh bandage and securing of the foot between 2 boards, which had to be lowered from the upper floor. This helped prevent further damage and had the man out of bed after 14 days and walking properly after 3 weeks, proving the effectiveness of my homeopathic treatment. So one man can thank his mobility to Mr. Gärtner. All right, and you saw examples of the handwriting before, and this is a great blow-up, but he also recorded all the baptisms that he did. And we've had thanks to the translation now, another volunteer, Jane Engelbert, go through all 260 pages and pull out all the baptisms. There's 170 baptisms recorded, and surprising to me, my own third or second great-grandfather, Conrad Nolden, was baptized by Father Gärtner in 1851, and we did not know his exact birth date. So that was a wonderful gift to me. And here's a database of these baptisms, which we now can order by any means we want, by place or last name or whatever, and send these off to places like Columbus and Watertown and give them some of these records. These are literally probably the only place this exists on the planet. These are not in the early church records. He also presided over scores of marriages. So there's 40 marriages just in volume 2 that are now recorded and we can share with people. And one last couple of tidbits on the Nolden family. My third great-grandparents, Conrad and Sabella Nolden, were here in 1845, just before Father Gärtner. And he was teaching school in 1851, and he said, "School and a stern reprimand to Nolden, who let his children get drunk with beer. The children cried over the scandal." Not sure if they were given the wrong ale, because the Germans, gave their kids, watered down ale to drink, but somehow they got drunk. And the next day, Nolden made amends in front of the school children. He also made a $100 donation to the building fund several months later. So what will the other diaries tell us? We don't know until they're done. Jonathan's been quite modest. Catherine did the transcription into German, but single-handedly, Jonathan did the translation into English. So I'd like to give him a round of applause for that. And we don't know. So if you go to St. Norbert's page on the Father Gärtner Diaries, you can see all of the 7 volumes that they hold, digitized versions, and also linked to volume 2 or diary 2 in the American translation. And you can also donate there. I believe there's a donate button. Yes, there is a donate button. So we are seeking funds to have somebody transcribe the next volume so that Jonathan can translate that into English for us. So get out your checkbooks and help us do that. And again, thanks to Lori and Jack and John Hart and others that are commenting, as mentioned, on these volumes so that we can add those comments as footnotes or endnotes and have more of an idea of what happened to these people, what happened after they got married, or did they survive, and who are these kids they're talking about that got drunk, So I'll be putting notes in on my own family in there. But so that is the Father Gärtner's diary. More to come, hopefully, in the next, not 60 years, but 20 years or so. Anyways, but any quick questions before we dismiss? You've been a great audience, and don't want to, but how many Noldens here? I made a Nolden family. Oh, yay! Yeah, we gotta. Yeah. Okay, good. We gotta have a little group photo later. So.